She moved through the restaurant like she had done 1,000 times before, quiet and careful, never drawing too much attention to herself. The place was always busy in the evenings, filled with the soft clatter of plates, low conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter from a corner table. It wasn't a fancy place, but it had a warm feeling that kept people coming back. The lights were dim enough to feel comfortable, and the smell of fresh food filled the air in a way that made people forget their worries for a while. For her, though, it was just work. She carried a tray in both hands, balancing it with practiced ease as she moved between tables. Her steps were light, almost silent, and she had a way of slipping in and out of spaces without interrupting anyone. Most customers barely looked at her face. They saw the uniform, the polite smile, the quick nod, and nothing more. She had become used to that. It didn't hurt anymore. In fact, it felt easier this way. Being unnoticed meant fewer questions. And she preferred it that way. Near the far corner of the restaurant stood something that most people didn't pay attention to at all. It was an old piano, dark with slightly worn at the edges. Its surface polished just enough to reflect the soft light above it. It looked like it belonged to another time. Sometimes guests would glance at it and smile, maybe even joke about someone playing it, but no one ever did. It was more of a decoration than anything else. But not to her. Every time she passed by it, even if she was in a hurry, her eyes would find it for just a second. That small glance held something deeper than curiosity. It was quiet, almost hidden, like a secret she carried inside her. No one noticed it. No one knew what it meant to her. Late at night, after the restaurant closed and the last customer had left, things felt different. The noise disappeared, the lights grew softer, and the air became still. That was the only time she allowed herself to slow down. While others rushed to finish cleaning and go home, she would take just a moment longer. Sometimes, when no one was watching, she would walk toward the piano. She never rushed. Each step felt careful, almost respectful, like she was approaching something important. Her fingers would hover just above the keys at first, not touching them right away. It was as if she needed a second to gather herself, to make sure no one was around. Then, very softly, she would press a key. The sound was gentle, slightly imperfect, but still beautiful. It would echo lightly in the empty room. That single note always seemed to carry more feeling than the noise of the entire evening. She would press another, then another, slowly forming a quiet melody that only the walls could hear. In those moments, she wasn't just a waitress. She was something else entirely. Her face would change too. The tension would leave her shoulders, and her eyes would soften. There was a kind of peace in her expression that never appeared during the busy hours. It was like she had stepped into a different world, one where she didn't have to hide. But those moments never lasted long. A sound from the kitchen, a voice from the back, or even the thought that someone might walk in would make her stop immediately. She would pull her hands away as if she had done something wrong. Then she would step back, take a breath, and return to her usual self. Quiet, careful, unnoticed. No one at work knew about this. They saw her as someone reliable, someone who did her job well and didn't cause trouble. She didn't talk much, and she never shared anything personal. When others laughed together during breaks, she would sit quietly, listening but not joining in. It wasn't that she didn't want to connect. It just felt easier to stay in the background. Her past wasn't something she spoke about. There had been a time long ago when music was not a secret. Back then, it was part of her everyday life. She remembered sitting for hours, practicing until her fingers felt tired but her heart felt full. Those memories were still there, but they felt distant now, like something that belonged to a different version of herself. Life had changed things. Responsibilities came one after another, leaving little space for dreams. What once felt possible slowly began to feel unrealistic. And so, little by little, she had pushed that part of herself aside. Not because she didn't love it anymore, but because she thought she had to. Still, the feeling never truly went away. It stayed hidden, waiting quietly, like the piano in the corner. One evening, the restaurant felt busier than usual. Every table was filled, and the air buzzed with energy. The sound of conversations overlapped, creating a constant hum. She moved quickly from one table to another, taking orders, delivering food, and making sure everything was running smoothly. Despite the rush, her movements remained calm. She didn't panic or rush unnecessarily. She had learned how to handle busy nights without letting it show. That calmness made her stand out in a subtle way, even if people didn't notice it directly. At one point, she passed by the piano again. For a brief second, her eyes met it. Something about that moment felt different. Maybe it was the noise of the crowd, or the way laughter filled the room, or perhaps it was just a feeling she couldn't explain. But for a second longer than usual, she looked at it. Then she kept walking. A table near the center of the room was louder than the others. A group of guests sat there, clearly enjoying themselves. Their voices carried across the room, filled with excitement and confidence. They seemed like people who were used to being noticed. As she approached their table with a tray, she could hear them talking about music. "Does anyone even play that thing anymore?" one of them said, pointing toward the piano. Another laughed. "Probably not. It's just for show." She placed the dishes on the table carefully, keeping her focus on her work. But she couldn't help hearing their conversation. "Someone should try it," another voice added casually. There was a pause, followed by light laughter. Then one of them glanced at her. "You?" the voice said, not unkindly, but with a playful tone. "Do you play?" The question caught her off guard. For a moment, she froze. It wasn't a serious question. It sounded more like a joke, something said in the moment without much thought. But to her, it felt heavier than that. She gave a small, polite smile and shook her head slightly. "No," she said softly. It was the easiest answer, the safest answer. They didn't push further. The conversation moved on quickly, and she stepped away from the table, continuing her work as if nothing had happened. But something inside her had shifted. The question stayed with her. As the night went on, she found herself thinking about it again and again. Not because of what they said, but because of how quickly she had answered. The word had come out so naturally, as if it had become her truth. No, she had said it so many times before. To others, to herself. Each time it had become easier. But tonight it felt different. She passed by the piano again later, carrying an empty tray. The room was still full, still loud, still alive with energy. But for a brief moment, everything else faded. Her eyes rested on the keys. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't look away immediately. Something inside her stirred, quiet but strong. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't demand attention. But it was there, steady and real, like a small flame that had never completely gone out. She didn't stop walking. She didn't touch the piano. Not yet. But as she moved past it, there was a feeling she couldn't ignore anymore. Something was changing. And even though she didn't know it yet, this ordinary night was slowly moving toward a moment that would change everything. The night kept getting louder, and the energy inside the restaurant didn't slow down. If anything, it grew stronger. Plates kept moving in and out of the kitchen. Glasses clinked together, and the sound of laughter rose above everything else. It was one of those evenings where people didn't want to leave. They were comfortable, relaxed, and fully lost in the moment. She continued doing her work the same way she always did. Quiet, focused, and careful. But something inside her wasn't as steady as usual. The simple question from earlier still lingered in her mind. "Do you play?" She had answered quickly, almost automatically. But now, the more she thought about it, the more it didn't sit right with her. It wasn't just a question. It felt like something that had pulled at a part of her she had tried to keep hidden for a long time. She carried another tray toward the same table, the one filled with loud, confident voices. As she approached, she noticed they were still talking about music. One of them was tapping their fingers against the table like they were playing invisible keys. Another was humming a tune, not perfectly, but with enthusiasm. "You know what would make this place better?" one of them said. "If someone actually played that piano." Another laughed. "Yeah. Instead of it just sitting there like a decoration. It probably doesn't even work," someone else added. More laughter followed. She placed the drinks on the table, keeping her expression calm. But inside, she felt something tighten slightly. She knew the piano worked. She had heard its voice many times, even if only in the quiet moments after closing. As she turned to leave, one of them spoke again. "Wait," the voice said, a bit louder this time. "You're here all the time, right?" She paused and looked back politely. "Yes," she replied. "Then you must have tried it at least once," the voice continued, pointing toward the piano again. "Come on. Just something simple." The others leaned in slightly, their interest growing. It still didn't feel serious, more like playful curiosity mixed with a bit of boredom. They were looking for entertainment, something different to break the usual routine of talking and eating. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She wasn't expecting this to continue. "I don't think," she started, her voice soft. "Oh, don't worry," another voice cut in with a smile. "We're not expecting anything big. Just a few notes. Something easy." "Yeah," someone else added, laughing lightly. "Just a simple piano piece. Nothing fancy." The words were casual, but they landed heavily. Simple. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Saying no again would be easy. She could walk away, return to her work, and let the moment pass like it never happened. That's what she had always done. But tonight felt different. The noise of the restaurant faded slightly in her ears, replaced by the quiet voice inside her that she had ignored for so long. It wasn't loud or demanding. It didn't push her. It just waited. The group at the table watched her, expecting either a quick refusal or a nervous attempt. To them, it was just a small moment of fun, something to laugh about and then forget. But for her, it didn't feel small at all. She glanced toward the piano. It stood there in the corner, unchanged, quiet, almost patient. The same piano she had approached so many times when no one was around. The same keys she had touched in secret, letting out pieces of herself that no one else had ever seen. Her hands tightened slightly around the empty tray she was holding. She hesitated again. "It's okay if you can't," one of them said, though their tone still carried a hint of amusement. "We were just joking." That sentence should have made it easier to walk away. But instead, it did the opposite. Something inside her shifted again. Not out of pressure. Not out of a need to prove anything. But out of something deeper. A quiet decision. She took a small breath. "I can try," she said softly. For a second, the table went quiet. Then came a few surprised smiles. "Really?" one of them said. "Well, this should be interesting," another added, leaning back in their chair. Word began to spread faster than she expected. Nearby tables started to notice. People turned their heads slightly, curious about what was happening. It wasn't every day that someone from the staff stepped away to play the piano. She felt the attention building, and with it came a wave of nervousness. What was she doing? Her heart beat faster with each step as she moved away from the table. The tray in her hands suddenly felt heavier, even though it was empty. She placed it down carefully at a nearby counter, trying to keep her movements steady. One of her co-workers looked at her with confusion. "What's going on?" they asked quietly. "They asked me to play," she replied, almost in a whisper. The co-worker raised their eyebrows in surprise but didn't say anything else. Now there was no turning back. She walked toward the piano. Each step felt slower than usual, as if time had stretched out. The sounds of the restaurant softened, not completely gone, but distant enough that they didn't feel overwhelming. All she could hear clearly was her own breathing and the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. As she reached the piano, she paused. Up close, it looked the same as always. The wood slightly worn, the keys not perfectly white anymore, but still inviting in a quiet way. It didn't look like something that could hold a powerful moment. But she knew better. She stood there for a second longer, her hands resting lightly at her sides. A part of her wanted to step back, to laugh it off, to say it was a mistake. But another part of her, the one she had kept hidden for so long, refused to let her walk away this time. Slowly, she pulled out the bench and sat down. The room grew quieter. Not completely silent, but enough that people were paying attention now. Conversations lowered, and a few more heads turned toward her. Even those who hadn't heard what was happening could feel that something unusual was about to take place. She placed her hands gently on her lap. Her fingers felt slightly cold. For a moment, she just sat there, looking at the keys. So many memories passed through her mind in that short silence. Late nights, quiet rooms, soft melodies played just for herself. Moments when music was the only thing that made sense. She took a slow breath. "You said simple," she whispered to herself, almost like a reminder. Her hands lifted slowly. They hovered above the keys, just like they always did in those quiet moments after closing. The feeling was familiar, even comforting in a strange way. But this time it was different. This time people were watching, waiting, expecting something small, something easy. Her fingers lowered slightly, almost touching the keys, but she paused again. For just a second, doubt returned. What if she made a mistake? What if the piano sounded worse than she remembered? What if they laughed? The thoughts came quickly, one after another. But then something else followed. A quieter thought. It wasn't about them. It wasn't about the room. It was about her. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. And in that moment, everything else disappeared. When she opened them again, there was a calmness in her expression that hadn't been there before. Her fingers touched the keys. The first note hadn't been played yet, but the moment had already begun. And no one in the room realized that what they were about to hear would be anything but simple. Her fingers rested on the keys for a brief moment, as if they were remembering something before beginning. The room had grown quieter now. It wasn't complete silence, but there was a clear shift. Conversations had softened, and people were watching with mild curiosity. Some expected a quick, awkward attempt. Others were just interested in seeing what would happen. She took a slow breath. Then she pressed the first key. The note was soft, almost too gentle to notice at first. It blended into the background noise of the restaurant, like a small ripple in a large space. A few people didn't even react. It was exactly what they expected, something simple, something easy. She played another note, then another. The melody began to form, slow and careful. Her fingers moved lightly, almost cautiously, as if testing the piano. The sound wasn't perfect. A few keys felt slightly off, but she adjusted without thinking. Her hands knew how to respond. They had done this many times before, even if no one had been there to hear it. At the table that had asked her to play, one of them leaned back in their chair and smiled slightly. "See?" they whispered to the others. "Just something simple." A few of them nodded, their attention already starting to drift back to their conversations. But she didn't notice them anymore. Her focus was on the piano, on the sound, on the feeling that was slowly building inside her. The first few notes were steady, quiet, and controlled. They felt like a doorway, something she had to pass through before reaching something deeper. Her shoulders were still slightly tense, but with each note, that tension began to fade. She adjusted her posture slightly, sitting a little straighter. Her fingers moved again. This time, the melody carried a bit more weight. It wasn't just a series of notes anymore. There was a flow to it, a quiet emotion that started to come through. It was still soft, still simple, but something about it felt different now. A couple at a nearby table paused their conversation. They didn't turn completely, but their ears caught the change. There was something in the way she played that didn't match the idea of a casual attempt. Felt real. Her hands moved a little more confidently now. The hesitation from before was slowly disappearing. Each note connected more naturally to the next. The rhythm became steadier, more certain. She wasn't thinking about the room anymore. She wasn't thinking about the people watching. She wasn't even thinking about the request to play something simple. She was just playing. The piano responded to her touch in a way that felt familiar. Even the slightly worn keys seemed to come alive under her fingers. The sound filled the space more clearly now, rising above the background noise without forcing itself. At the table in the center, the group that had asked her to play began to notice the shift. One of them leaned forward slightly. "Wait," they said quietly. "Listen." Another turned their head fully toward the piano. The melody had changed again. It was still gentle, but there was a deeper feeling behind it now. Something that made people pause, even if they didn't fully understand why. Her fingers moved with more ease, gliding across the keys without hesitation. It was as if the piano wasn't something separate from her anymore. It felt like an extension of her, a voice she had kept silent for too long. A few more people in the room began to notice. The clatter of plates didn't stop, but it felt less important now. Conversations continued, but they were softer, more scattered. The music was slowly becoming the center of attention, even if no one had officially announced it. She shifted slightly on the bench, her movements becoming more natural. The melody grew just a little stronger. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to carry more presence. Her face had changed too. The nervousness from earlier was gone. In its place was something calmer, more focused. Her eyes followed her hands as they moved, but there was also a distant look, like she was seeing something beyond the room. Memories began to surface again. Not clearly, not in full detail, but in pieces. Long hours spent practicing. Moments of frustration and small victories. The quiet joy of getting a passage just right. All of it flowed into her playing without her needing to think about it. The music carried those feelings, even if the people listening couldn't name them. At one table, someone who had been scrolling on their phone slowly lowered it. They looked up, drawn in without realizing it. At another table, a conversation stopped mid-sentence. "What is that?" someone whispered, not in confusion, but in quiet interest. The group that had started it all was now fully watching. Their expressions had shifted from casual amusement to something more serious. "She's not bad," one of them said softly. Another shook their head slightly. "No, that's more than not bad." But she still wasn't finished. The melody continued to build, slowly and naturally. It didn't rush. It didn't try to impress. It just grew. Her left hand added depth, creating a soft foundation beneath the notes her right hand carried. The balance between them became smoother, more controlled. Each movement felt intentional, even if she wasn't actively planning it. She had stopped thinking completely. This was the part she knew best. The part where everything else disappeared. Her breathing matched the rhythm without her noticing. Her fingers moved faster now, but still with control. There was no panic, no rush, just flow. The piano no longer sounded like an old decoration in the corner. It sounded alive. The room responded in small ways. People leaned in slightly. Heads turned more fully. Even those who had been uninterested at the beginning were starting to pay attention. There was something about the music that felt honest. It wasn't trying to be perfect. It wasn't trying to show off. It just felt real. And that was enough to hold people's attention. She shifted into a slightly different pattern, adding more movement to the melody. It was still simple on the surface, but there were layers beneath it now. Small details that gave it depth, making it feel richer than it first appeared. Her hands moved more freely across the keys. The hesitation from the beginning was completely gone. In its place was confidence. Not loud or proud, just steady and quiet. At the center table, one of the guests sat up straighter. "This isn't what I expected," they said under their breath. "No," another replied, their eyes fixed on her hands. "Not at all." The room had changed without anyone realizing exactly when it happened. What started as a light moment had turned into something else. Something people didn't want to interrupt. The music continued, flowing naturally from one phrase to the next. It was no longer just a simple tune, but it hadn't reached its full form yet. It was still building, still growing, and she could feel it. Deep inside, there was a shift happening. Something that had been held back for too long was starting to come forward. Her fingers pressed the keys with a little more strength now. The sound responded, clearer, fuller, more alive. The next notes came with a quiet sense of purpose. And in that moment, without saying a single word, she began to move beyond the simple melody they had asked for. Something bigger was coming, and no one in the room was ready for it. The music didn't stop, but something inside it began to change. At first, it was so subtle that only a few people noticed. The melody she had been playing, soft and gentle, started to carry more weight. It wasn't just flowing anymore, it was building. Her fingers moved with a new kind of purpose, pressing the keys with slightly more strength, as if she was no longer holding anything back. The sound grew deeper, not louder in a harsh way but fuller, richer. It spread across the room in a way that made it hard to ignore. The quiet conversations that had continued in the background slowly began to fade. People didn't decide to stop talking. It just happened naturally, like the music was asking for their attention without saying a word. At the table in the center, the group that had asked her to play sat still now. No one was laughing anymore. No one was making light comments. Their eyes were fixed on her. And there was a shared feeling among them that something unexpected was unfolding right in front of them. Her hands moved faster, not rushed, but confident. The simple tune they had expected was no longer there. It had grown into something else entirely. The notes came together in a way that felt powerful, almost like they carried a story of their own. Each movement of her fingers seemed natural, effortless, as if she wasn't thinking about what came next. She just knew. Her posture had changed too. She wasn't sitting carefully anymore, trying not to make a mistake. She sat firmly, fully present, her shoulders relaxed but steady. Her face showed focus but also something deeper, something emotional, something real. She wasn't playing for them anymore. She was playing because she needed to. The piano responded to her in a way that felt alive. The old keys, slightly worn and uneven, didn't limit her. Instead, they added character to the sound, making it feel raw and honest. Every note had a texture, a feeling that went beyond just sound. The rhythm picked up. Her left hand moved with more strength, creating a strong bass, while her right hand danced across the higher keys with speed and control. The contrast between them created a kind of tension that pulled people in even more. At one table, a man who had been eating paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. He didn't even realize he had stopped. His attention was completely on the piano now. At another table, a woman leaned forward slightly, her eyes wide with quiet surprise. "This is different," she whispered. No one replied. They were all too focused. The music continued to rise, building layer by layer. It felt like something was unfolding, something that had been waiting for the right moment to be heard. The energy in the room shifted completely. What had once been a lively, noisy space was now filled with a different kind of energy. One that felt focused, almost electric. She could feel it too. Not the people, not the room, but the music itself. It was moving through her in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. There was no hesitation left, no fear of making a mistake. Every note felt right, even the ones that weren't perfectly clean. It didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling, and that feeling was growing stronger. Her fingers moved faster now, gliding across the keys with precision. The melody twisted and turned, shifting in ways that kept it alive and unpredictable. It wasn't something simple anymore. It wasn't something anyone in the room could have expected. It was something powerful. At the center table, one of the guests leaned closer to the others. "This isn't normal," they said quietly. Another nodded, their eyes still locked on her hands. "She's trained. She has to be." "But how?" Someone else started, then stopped, unable to finish the thought. Because there was no simple explanation. She didn't look like someone about to perform something like this. She had been moving between tables just minutes ago, carrying plates, taking orders, blending into the background like she always did. And now she was holding the entire room in silence. The music reached a point where it felt almost too big for the space. It filled every corner, every small gap of quiet. Even the staff in the kitchen had slowed down, some of them stepping closer to the door just to listen. No one wanted to interrupt it. No one dared to. Her expression changed again, just slightly. There was intensity in it now. Not anger, not sadness, but something stronger. It was as if all the time she had spent holding this part of herself back was finally being released. Every note carried that feeling. Every movement of her hands pushed it further. She leaned into the music without realizing it. Her body moved slightly with the rhythm, not in a dramatic way, but naturally, like she was part of it. Her fingers struck the keys with more force now, creating a sound that was bold and full. And then, the melody shifted again. This time it was sudden. A burst of energy. Faster notes. Stronger movements. The calm, steady flow from before turned into something intense. Something that demanded attention. It felt like a wave rising higher and higher, building toward something no one could quite predict. A few people in the room exchanged quick glances. They could feel it too. Something was coming. The music wasn't just playing anymore. It was pushing forward, carrying momentum that couldn't be stopped. Her hands moved with incredible speed now, but still with control. There was no chaos in it. Every note landed exactly where it needed to, creating a sound that felt both powerful and precise. The piano, once ignored, had become the center of everything. And she was no longer invisible. At the center table, one of the guests whispered, almost to themselves, "This is not simple." No one responded. They didn't need to. The truth was already clear. The music climbed higher, reaching a peak that filled the room with intensity. It wasn't overwhelming in a harsh way, but it was impossible to ignore. It held people in place, making it hard to look away, hard to think about anything else. Her fingers pressed the keys with strength, her movements confident and sure. There was no sign of doubt anymore. No hesitation. Just control. Just feeling. Just truth. And then, just when it seemed like it couldn't go any further, she pushed it even higher. The notes came faster, sharper, more alive. It felt like fire moving through the music, something bright and unstoppable. The sound carried a kind of energy that made people sit up straighter, their attention completely locked in. This was no longer a performance. It was a moment, a real one, the kind that doesn't come often, the kind that people remember. The final section began to form, though no one in the room knew it yet. The music had reached its strongest point, and there was a sense that it was building toward something final. Something that would bring everything together. Her hands moved with one last surge of energy, every note placed with purpose. The sound filled the space completely, leaving no room for anything else. And in that moment, every person in the room understood the same thing without needing to say it. They had expected something small, something simple, but what they were hearing was something unforgettable. The final notes didn't come all at once. They arrived slowly, like the music itself was deciding how to end. After the intensity, after the fast and powerful movements, her hands began to slow down. The sound softened, but it didn't lose its depth. Felt controlled, thoughtful, almost careful again. Her fingers moved gently across the keys, guiding the music back from its highest point. It wasn't a sudden stop. It was a gradual return, like a wave settling after reaching the shore. The room stayed completely still. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the smallest sounds, the clink of a glass, the shifting of a chair, had disappeared. It was as if the entire space was holding its breath, waiting for the last note. She played a few more soft notes, each one clear and steady. Then, with one final touch, she pressed the last key. The sound lingered in the air for a brief moment. And then, silence. It was a different kind of silence than before. Not casual, not distracted. It was full, heavy in the best way. Like everyone needed a second to understand what they had just heard. Her hands stayed on the keys for a moment longer. She didn't move right away. Her breathing was slightly uneven. Not from fear, but from the release of everything she had just poured into the music. Slowly, she lifted her hands and rested them in her lap. She looked down at the piano, not at the people. For a second, it felt like she had forgotten where she was. Then the room came back. The quiet shifted. And suddenly, applause. It started with one person. A single clap, sharp in the silence. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire room was filled with it. People stood up from their chairs without thinking. Some clapped slowly, others with energy. But all of them shared the same feeling. Respect, surprise, and something close to disbelief. The sound of applause grew louder, filling the space just as the music had moments before. She looked up, startled. This kind of reaction wasn't something she was used to. Her eyes moved across the room, taking in the faces of people who had once been strangers, people who had barely noticed her before. Now they were all looking at her, not as a waitress, not as someone passing by, but as someone who had just given them something real, something meaningful. At the center table, the group that had asked her to play was standing too. Their expressions had completely changed. The playful smiles were gone. In their place was something more serious, more genuine. One of them shook their head slightly, almost in disbelief, while continuing to clap. Another leaned forward, as if trying to understand what they had just seen. As the applause continued, she slowly stood up from the bench. Her movements were quiet again, almost careful, like she wasn't sure what to do next. She gave a small, polite nod, not knowing how else to respond. She wasn't used to being in this position. The attention felt unfamiliar, but it didn't feel uncomfortable, just new. After a moment, the applause began to settle, though the energy in the room didn't disappear. People were still watching her, still talking quietly among themselves, still trying to process what had just happened. She stepped away from the piano. For a second, she thought about returning to work immediately, picking up a tray and continuing like nothing had changed. That had always been her way. But before she could move further, one of the guests from the center table approached her. They didn't rush. They walked with purpose, but also with a kind of respect. "Wait," they said, their voice calm but filled with curiosity. She paused. "Yes," she replied softly. For a moment, the person didn't speak. They looked at her, as if trying to match what they had just heard with the person standing in front of them. "That wasn't simple," they finally said. There was no judgment in their tone, only honesty. She gave a small, almost shy smile. "I know," she replied. There was a brief silence between them. Then another voice joined, one of the others from the table stepping closer. "Where did you learn to play like that?" they asked. The question was direct, but not harsh. Carried genuine interest. She hesitated for a second. Not because she didn't want to answer, but because she didn't know how to explain it simply. "A long time ago," she said quietly. "That's not something you just learn and forget," the first person said. She nodded slightly. "They didn't forget," she replied. The words were simple, but they held more meaning than she explained. The small group around her grew slightly as a few more people came closer, still curious, still drawn to the moment. "Do you play anywhere else?" someone asked. She shook her head. "No." "Why not?" another voice said, almost surprised. She didn't answer right away. The question wasn't new. She had asked herself the same thing many times before, but the answer had never been simple. "Life," she said finally, her voice calm. It wasn't a full explanation, but it was enough. The people around her seemed to understand, even without more details. There was a quiet pause. Then one of them spoke again, their tone more thoughtful now. "You shouldn't be hiding that," they said. She looked at them, unsure how to respond. For so long, hiding it had felt like the only option. It wasn't something she had chosen in one moment. It had happened slowly over time, shaped by circumstances, responsibilities, and choices that didn't leave much room for anything else. "I didn't think anyone would care," she said honestly. The person shook their head slightly. "That room cared," they replied, glancing around. She followed their gaze. People were still watching, still whispering, still looking at her with a kind of quiet respect. It was hard to ignore. For the first time in a long while, she saw herself the way others were seeing her in that moment. Not as someone invisible, not as someone in the background, but as someone who had something worth listening to, something worth noticing. The realization didn't come all at once, settled slowly, but it stayed. One of her co-workers approached, still looking surprised. "I didn't know you could play like that," they said. She gave a small smile. "I never told anyone." "Well," the co-worker replied, glancing back at the piano, "you probably should have." There was no pressure in their voice, just a simple truth. She looked at the piano again. It was the same as it had always been. Old, quiet, standing in the corner. But it didn't feel the same anymore. Something about it had changed. Or maybe, something about her had. The moment wasn't just about the music. It wasn't just about the applause. It was about something deeper. Something that had been hidden for too long finally being seen. And once something like that is seen, it can't easily go back to being invisible. The restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but something about it felt different now. The same tables were there, the same lights, the same soft background sounds, but the feeling had changed. It was as if the room itself remembered what had just happened. She stood near the counter for a moment, unsure of what to do next. For so long, her routine had been simple. Take orders, serve food, clear tables, repeat. There was comfort in that pattern. It didn't ask too much from her. And in return, she didn't have to think about anything beyond the next task. But now, that routine felt slightly unfamiliar. Not wrong, just different. Her coworker gently nudged her. "You might want to get back," they said with a small smile, pointing toward a table waiting for service. She nodded quickly, almost relieved to have something normal to do. "Yes," she said, picking up a tray again. Her hands moved the same way they always had, steady, careful, but inside, things were not the same. As she walked toward the table, she could feel eyes on her. Not in a heavy or uncomfortable way, but in a curious one. People were noticing her now, really noticing her. At the table, the guests greeted her with warm smiles. "That was amazing," one of them said as she placed the glasses down. She paused for a second, then gave a small nod. "Thank you." The words felt simple, but they carried more meaning than usual. She moved to another table, then another. Each time someone said something. "You have real talent. That was beautiful. I didn't expect that at all." She responded politely, but quietly, not knowing how to fully accept the praise. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate it. It was just new. For years, her effort had gone unnoticed. Her music had lived in silence, shared only with empty rooms. Now suddenly it had reached people, and it had stayed with them. The group at the center table remained longer than the others. They weren't laughing as loudly anymore. Their energy had shifted into something more thoughtful. When she approached them again, they greeted her differently this time. Not casually, not playfully, but with respect. "You should sit for a minute," one of them said, gesturing toward an empty chair nearby. She hesitated. "I'm working," she replied softly. "Just a minute," another added. "Please." There was something sincere in their tone. After a brief pause, she nodded and sat down, still holding onto a sense of caution. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of them leaned forward slightly. "Have you ever thought about doing this seriously?" they asked. The question wasn't surprising, but it still felt heavy. "I used to," she said. "What happened?" someone else asked. She looked down for a second, choosing her words carefully. "Things changed," she replied. They didn't interrupt. They waited. "Life doesn't always go the way you plan," she continued quietly. "Sometimes you have to choose what's possible instead of what you want." There was no sadness in her voice, just honesty. The group exchanged brief glances, as if they understood more than they expected to. "But you didn't stop," one of them said. She shook her head slightly. "No." "Good," they replied. There was a pause. Then one of them reached into their pocket and pulled out a small card. They placed it gently on the table in front of her. "If you ever want to try again," they said, "this could help." She looked at the card but didn't pick it up right away. Felt like more than just a piece of paper. Felt like a door. And she wasn't sure if she was ready to open it. "I don't know," she said honestly. "That's okay," the person replied. "You don't have to decide now. Just don't ignore what you have." The words stayed with her. She picked up the card slowly and held it between her fingers. It was simple, just a name and a number, but it carried weight. The group didn't push further. They smiled, thanked her again, and soon after, they left the restaurant. But the feeling they left behind stayed. The rest of the night passed in a quiet blur. She continued working, but her mind kept returning to the same thoughts. The music, the applause, the conversations, the card in her pocket. When the last customer finally left and the doors were closed, the restaurant fell into its usual silence. The lights dimmed slightly. The noise disappeared. It was the same quiet she had known for so long. But tonight it felt different. She finished her task slowly, taking more time than usual. Her coworker noticed but didn't say anything. They simply gave her a small smile before heading out. "You're locking up tonight?" they asked. She nodded. "All right, don't stay too late." "I won't," she replied. Soon she was alone. The silence wrapped around the room, soft and familiar. She stood still for a moment, then turned her eyes toward the piano. It was there, just like always, waiting. She walked toward it, her steps slow and thoughtful. When she reached it, she didn't hesitate this time. She pulled out the bench and sat down just like she had earlier, but the feeling was not the same. There was no fear now, no hesitation, only something quiet and steady. She placed her hands on the keys. For a moment she didn't play. She just sat there, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. Then she began. The notes were soft at first, just like before, but they carried a different feeling now. There was no hiding in them, no holding back. It wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about being seen. It was just her. The music filled the empty room, gentle and real. And as she played, she realized something. Nothing had changed overnight. Her life was still the same. The job was still there. The responsibilities were still there. But something inside her had shifted. Something important. For the first time in a long while, the idea of something more didn't feel impossible. It didn't feel distant. Felt close. When she finished playing, she looked down at her hands. Then she reached into her pocket and took out the card. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she didn't put it away. Instead, she placed it gently on top of the piano. Not hidden, not forgotten, just there, in sight. She stood up, took one last look at the room, and turned off the lights. As she walked toward the door, she didn't rush. There was no need to. For the first time, it felt like she wasn't just leaving work. She was stepping into something new, something uncertain, but something real. And behind her, in the quiet corner of the darkened room, the piano remained. No longer just a forgotten piece of furniture, but the beginning of a story that was finally ready to be lived.